The Second Coming by William Yeats. William Butler Yeats wrote The Second Coming in 1920. He is widely to be considered one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. He belonged to the Protestant Anglo-Irish minority that had control of the economic, political, social, and cultural life in Ireland. He was a writer and a playwright, and he was involved in occultism and theosophy, which played emphasis on spiritual and religious concepts in nature, and that is what sparked his writings as a symbolist. So the symbolist movement was between 1886 and 1900. It was the link between Romanticism and Modernism, and it focused on transcendence with a more decadent and sensual take. It used obscure beginnings but contained deep symbols and intuitive associations. It also used dusk and dawn as well as the time between waking up and sleep as a symbol of deep meaning. Dreams or dream states were prominently used in symbolist art, and synesthesia was also used, which is the use of figurative language of blending human senses to describe an object. Some examples would be chilly gaze or loud dress, that mixes auditory, visual, and sensory feelings. Overall, the symbolist movement focused on virtual withdrawal from the life and a concentration on the experiences and expression through the use of symbols. So the Second Coming is a blank verse poem. A blank verse has a consistent meter, no rhyme scheme, and a traditional 10-syllable line iambic pentameter. So the Second Coming is divided into two stanzas with 22 lines in total. And you can see here that how the stanzas are breaking up, it does not follow a particular formal tradition. So how the Second Coming is broken up, the second stanza has 14 lines, which is the same length as a sonnet. Some interpretations see it as the first stanza is a fragment of a sonnet that is later interrupted by the full sonnet of the second stanza. And it is consistent with the blank verse how the Second Coming has no rhyme scheme. So words like gyre, falconer, hold, world, everywhere, drown, worst, and intensity have no coherent rhyme scheme. And you can see here how the traditional 14-line sonnet is shown in the second stanza. So the second coming also has a traditional iambic pentameter with the ba-dum ba-dum meter. It is not as regular as Shakespeare's work since it uses a long short instead of a short long syllable structure, such as I believe it was surely instead of the short long. In most lines, the poem also has 10 syllables, but sometimes there are lines such as line 13 which have 12 syllables. So the traditional iambic pentameter with 10 syllables can be seen in the highlighted yellow. So for example, in line 4, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, which is 10 syllables. And then the ones that break from that 10 syllable tradition is the orange highlighted, which is line 13, which has 12 syllables, which goes troubles my sight somewhere in sands of the desert. So overall, Yeats follows the blank verse structure with no rhyme scheme and has the 10-syllable iambic pentameter with just a few exceptions.
So I did the poem meaning for The Second Coming. The poem is sort of a conveyance of William Butler Yeats's views of the way the world was right after World War I, which he believed was an unnecessary waste of money and human life. Throughout the poem, you can see this meaning as he talks about the world in a very pessimistic way, and he also hints that maybe this is the beginning of the apocalypse, sort of going with that pessimistic view. And then lastly, he kind of defines this as the end of an era. In lines 1 and 2, Yeats talks about this changing of eras in a sort of metaphorical way, where he uses a falcon flying in circles to represent changing through eras of time. In Yeats's other works, he uses gyres to symbolize history moving toward instability. In this metaphor, since the falcon represents time, the falcon not listening to the falconer could be seen as symbolic of time not responding to humanity. And then also, since the falcon is circling, which is usually done by birds of prey over a dying or dead animal, this could be symbolic of humanity heading towards its demise, which kind of goes with that pessimistic view that Yeats has. In lines 3 through 6, Yeats talks in general about the present world being in general chaos. The quote from line 3, "The center cannot hold," can be interpreted as politics becoming increasingly divided and moderate political views, or what would be the center, not holding anymore. And then he makes an apocalyptic sort of reference in lines 5 and 6, where he uses words like tide and drowned, which are possibly a biblical reference to the story of Noah's Ark. Lines 7 and 8 are quite ambiguous, as Yeats doesn't define who the best and worst are here. I interpret the best as being people who have similar views to Yeats, but I guess unlike Yeats, they aren't willing to say anything or do anything about it, because he describes them as lacking conviction. The worst are probably the people in power in the world, and they remain in power, he says, because of their passionate intensity. Line 9 begins sort of a shift in the poem, where Yeats goes from talking about his present view of the world to talking about sort of a dreamlike view of the future he has. These lines here reference the second coming of Christ from the book of Revelations in the Bible, where it is said that Christ would be reborn. And Yeats believes that since the world is in so much chaos right now, surely the second coming must be soon. Yeats expresses doubts in this in lines 9 and 10, where he uses repetition of the word surely, as if he isn't 100% sure the second coming is actually going to happen. Lines 12 through 14 describe a vision Yeats says he has from Spiritus Mundi, which is literally Latin for spirit of the world, and it's sort of a collection of ideas and memories that anyone could tap into. So it's sort of a supernatural thing, and supernatural things like this are common throughout Yeats' works, because he believed that humans had a supernatural connection to one another. And so here through this vision, Yeats says he sees a shape with lion body and the head of a man, which is likely the Sphinx in ancient Egypt. In lines 15 through 17, Yeats begins to describe what the Sphinx is doing. He describes it as having a blank and pitiless gaze, kind of conveying that the Sphinx doesn't really have a care for humanity. And then he also says that the Sphinx begins to move, which disturbs the birds. Lines 18 through 20 mark the end of Yeats' vision, and now Yeats knows that this second coming is not going to be the birth of Christ. Yeats mentions in these lines a cradle, which would provide evidence that something is being born, and then he also mentions a nightmare, which is likely a reference to World War I. And he also talks about 20 centuries of stony sleep, which is kind of weird because Jesus Christ would have been born about 20 centuries before this poem was written, but it describes it as stony sleep, which kind of references the Sphinx, which would have been built way before 20 centuries ago. And then lines 21 through 22 describe the beast beginning to move toward Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus Christ. The birth of the Sphinx that Yeats describes can be interpreted
devices. The first thing we're going to analyze is the rhyme and rhythm. So the poem The Second Coming follows a blank verse format, meaning that it follows no particular rhyme scheme throughout it at all. But it, however, still follows iambic pentameter, which is what we've been seeing throughout Shakespeare's works, which shows the 2 beats and a total of 10 beats per line, but like 2 beats together 5 times. So the first example of symbolism that we see in our poem is in the first line when the author says, turning and turning in the widening gear. And the literal meaning of this is a vortex located over air. But in the poem, it can represent how life is always changing and swirling with humanity. The next example is seen in line 2, where he says, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. The literal sense of this is that a falcon is lost without reason, blind in the air, and the falconer is literal for a controlling figure. But in this poem, the falcon represents humanity who is lost to the mercy of the uncontrollable, like war and just loss of morals, and the falconer is God or a widespread ethics, depending on how you view this poem, whether it's in a religious sense or just post-World War. The next example is the blood-dimmed tide is loosed and everywhere. This represents the overwhelming violence and uncontrollable chaos that has infected the world post-World War I, and how they predict that there will be more blood shed and lives lost. Next, there's a large symbolistic figure that they talk about in the second stanza of the poem, and the author says, a shape with lion body and head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. And in Greek mythology, the Sphinx was the bearer of riddle, like prophecies, and here the Sphinx in a way could be standing in front of the answers that the world seeks, but in another way, the Sphinx could represent the prophecy that the world is coming to an end, the world is lost due to this post-apocalyptic world after war. And so then we see a connection to this in the next line, which says, real shadows of indignant desert birds. And this represents the approaching of death coming and it like infecting the world. And so it follows this prophecy that our apocalyptic world is going to lead to even more death post-World War I, and what he predicts as the future. Next, we see an allusion, and it says, surely some revelation is at hand, surely the second coming is at hand. And this is an allusion to Revelations in the Bible, and in there it talks about Jesus' second coming. And in this poem, we kind of believe that he was saying, surely some revelation is at hand, like surely not, hopefully God is coming back because our humanity is lost, but also like something else could be coming, like the Sphinx that comes later on in the poem. And then we see some alliteration in the first stanza. We see them say turning and turning, and then the repeat of the, things, the, throughout the beginning of that. And that's almost all of the first stanza, but then we don't really see that much repeating of it in the second stanza. However, we do see some more where it says, troubles my sight somewhere in the sands. So sight, somewhere, sands. And then we see it again during the darkness drops, and again with stony sleep. So we see a little bit of a different kind of alliteration throughout the different stanzas, but still similar. And then we just see the word loosed repeat twice in connection to them. That could be seen as assonance or just a repetition of the word.
So, poem reaction. So, when you're reading through this poem is sad, it's dark, it's apocalyptic, it represents the end of an era. The author is writing this after World War I. There's human suffering as far as the eye can see. It's just a very dark poem, and the symbolism is very powerful, as we just explained. So to go into it, we thought that the message of this poem was that Yeats conveyed a message of the never-ending and apathetic march of time, though uncertain and seemingly doomed after World War I. So to examine this in pieces, first, the never-ending and apathetic march of time. To the left, we see the lines. And while we have already talked about the symbolism of the falcon and the falconer as it represents time versus humanity, just to reiterate, the falcon is time and the falconer is humanity. And the falcon continues to turn and turn in this widening gyre, showing that time continues to pass, even past World War I and all the human suffering left in its wake. Time does not care. Time spares no emotion for humanity. It's almost apathetic in a way. And apathy is characterized as a lack of interest, a lack of enthusiasm, and a lack of concern. And this is what's being shown by the falcon, which represents time, to the falconer, who represents humanity. And then time, though uncertain and seemingly doomed. To the left is the line describing the Sphinx as it slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. And as the Sphinx moves toward Bethlehem to be born, this rough beast, in stark contrast to baby Jesus, who was also born in Bethlehem, the aforementioned 20 centuries ago, really creates a contrast that is very strong. And so notably, this poem ends in a question, which acknowledges the author's uncertainty about the second coming of Christ, though he believes it to be soon, from this poem. And then, of course, restating an earlier point, the author of the poem acknowledges that the second coming is going to be much different than the first, again, drawing back to the Sphinx versus baby Jesus. The author acknowledges that the second coming will be much different than the first. And biblically, the second coming is the second coming of Christ, which is also Judgment Day, which results in the earth's destruction, which is not good. And so overall, does the poet do a good job of conveying this message? Why or why not? We believe that the poet does do a good job through the use of symbols and choices throughout the piece. We examined those symbols and choices earlier, but notably, the piece ending in a question was very intriguing to us. Again, it shows Yeats's uncertainty about what is to come, and it leaves the poem in a sort of open-ended question. There are no answers. And once again, our group enjoyed this poem thoroughly. While initially obscured, the meaning was initially obscured. It was sort of confusing as you are seeing all of these symbols, but no explanation. But once Yeats's symbols and literary choices were thoroughly analyzed, thoroughly explained, the message of the poem became clear. So, just to reiterate, does the poet do a good job of conveying this message? We think so. Yes. Thank you.